Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out the highly requested 13500, Intel's new $250 Core i5, packing 14 cores in total, 20 threads, and 35.5 megabytes of cache. This is a very interesting, almost hybrid-like CPU, as it packs the larger L3 cache capacity of the Raptor Lake i5s, while using the smaller L2 cache of Alder Lake. So it's not merely a locked version of the impressive 13600K. Therefore, I am very keen to see how it performs. But before we do...
Today's video is sponsored by Gigabyte and their Aorus and Aero RTX 30 series laptops. These excellent machines for gamers and creators are powered by up to an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3080 Ti graphics card and up to Intel Core i9 processors. Gamers will be interested in the Aorus 17X featuring high-performance GeForce RTX graphics, support for DLSS and ray tracing, a super fast 360Hz display, and heaps of cooling power. For creators, check out the Aero 16 with its 4K OLED display, portable form factor, and efficient GeForce RTX GPU. There's plenty of other options in Gigabyte's lineup as well, so learn more via the links below.
Okay, so the 13500, it's a very interesting processor. When compared to the 13600K, you get the same 6P cores with hyper-threading for 12 threads, but whereas the 13600K cores clock as high as 5.1 GHz, the 13500 is capped at 4.8 GHz. The big change to the P cores though is the L2 cache capacity, which has been downgraded from 2 MB to 1.25 MB, so the same capacity as Alder Lake CPUs, whereas the K-SKU Raptor Lake parts all receive a 2 MB update, which does help to boost performance. As for the E-cores, the 13500 retains all 8, so the same core count as the 13600K and twice that of the 12600K. And that's a big deal, as the 12th gen locked Core i5, such as the 12500, didn't feature any E-cores at all, so we're going from 0 to 8 in a single generation. However, like the P-cores, the E-cores are receiving the 12th gen cache capacity, meaning unlike the E-cores of the 13600K, which pack a 4 MB capacity per cluster, the 13500 has been downgraded to 2 MB per cluster. Yet despite those downgrades to the L2 cache capacity, the L3 cache remains at 24 MB. And that's the same capacity that we see with the 13600K, meaning there's 4 MB more L3 cache than what you get with the 12600K and 6 MB more than what you got with the 12500. So at $250 US, the 13500 could be well positioned as the best value all-rounder for more budget-oriented builds, and its main competition here really would be the Ryzen 5 7600. Now, the 13500 does have the advantage of working on cheaper B660 motherboards using DDR4 memory, so I'll certainly be looking at that along with the DDR5 configuration. And for this testing, I'll be using the G.Skill Ripjaws V-Series 32GB DDR4 3600CL16 memory, as it can currently be had for $115 US. It's a really good quality kit that offers a nice balance of price to performance. Now, please note that locked Intel processors cannot run above DDR4 3466 if you want to use the Gear 1 mode, and ideally you do want to use the Gear 1 mode, as the memory has to run well above DDR4 4000 before Gear 2 can match Gear 1. And the reason for this limitation is due to the fact that the system agent or SA voltage is locked on non-K-SKU processors, and this limits the memory controller's ability to support high-frequency memory while using the Gear 1 mode. So that being the case, I've tested the 13500 using the Ripjaws memory adjusted to 3466, as this is the most optimal configuration for this processor, short of manually tuning the memory timings, which we're not doing for this content. Now, the primary competitor for the 13500 is the Ryzen 5 7600, so this will be the comparison I focus on. However, I've also included a number of other processors for reference, but please note the data isn't always apples to apples, at least in terms of the memory configurations. The AM4 processors, for example, were tested using DDR4 3200CL14 memory, though in the past we have found this memory to be comparable to DDR4 3600CL16, but in any case, I just wanted to point out that difference. Okay, let's get into the data. Firstly, here's a look at how the 13500 operates using the supplied box cooler, which I won't actually be using for our testing as it's not very good, and you should absolutely replace it when buying this processor. A cheap $20 US tower style cooler will do a much better job. Anyway, with the box cooler installed, thermal throttling kicked in after roughly 25 seconds. Initially, the 13500P cores ran at 4.5 GHz with the E cores at 3.5 GHz, but after an hour, the P cores were forced down to 4.2 GHz and the E cores ran at 3.4 GHz. So that's a 7% reduction for the P cores and just a 3% drop for the E cores. Those certainly aren't massive performance dips, but it is worth noting that the core temperature ran at 92 degrees with a CPU package temperature of 100 degrees, and this is while throttling. As usual, we ditched the terrible box cooler for our testing and instead used the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm AIO. With the liquid cooler, the 13500 maintained a P-core frequency of 4.5 GHz and an E-core frequency of 3.5 GHz. So after an hour of load, we saw no dip in the clock speeds. That's because the 13500 ran at just 62 degrees, so well below the thermal threshold. Starting with the Cinebench R23 multi-core results, we see that the 13500 is indeed very impressive for core-heavy productivity workloads that can utilize the E-cores well. When compared to the 7600, we're looking at a 44% increase in performance. That's a massive gain that sees the locked i5 even outpacing the 7700X. It was also just 12% slower than the 13600K, and that difference for this test is purely down to the clock speed, as cache plays a very small role here. Now, the single core performance is similar to the 7600 and slightly less than that of the 12600K for the simple fact that the 12th gen part does clock a bit higher. Still, when compared to the 13600K, we're talking about a mere 6% reduction in single core performance. The 7-zip file manager compression results are heavily influenced by memory performance. The 13500 using an optimal DDR4 configuration is only around 10% faster than the 5600X, but 16% slower than the 7600. However, when armed with DDR5 memory, the 13500 is 14% faster than the 7600, though it did still trail the 13600K by a 14% margin, but I suppose that's somewhat to be expected. Still, overall, very good performance here, especially given the price. However, we see that DRAM performance has almost no influence on decompression performance, so here the 13500 does well using either DDR4 or DDR5 memory, delivering comparable performance to that of the 5800X, making it up to 10% faster than the 7600. The Blender Open Data results are very impressive. Here the E-cores are working well, and as a result we're looking at Ryzen 7 7700 like performance, making the 13500 at least 28% faster than the 7600 and just 12% slower than the 13600K. And it's a similar story in the Corona benchmark. Here the 13500 is 13% slower than the 13600K, but 37% faster than the 7600, and performance was much the same using either DDR4 or DDR5 memory. Next up we have Premiere Pro 2022, and here we see when using DDR4 memory that the 13500 is slower than the 5800X, as well as the 7600, trailing by a 9% margin. But when paired with DDR5 memory, the locked Core i5 enjoys a massive 21% performance bump, allowing it to beat the 7600 by an 11% margin to come in just 4% slower than the 13600K. We're also seeing solid performance gains when upgrading from DDR4 to DDR5 in Photoshop, with DDR5 providing an additional 17% performance. Even so, the E-cores are virtually useless in this lightly threaded application, meaning the 7600 is slightly faster here. The last of the Adobe software we have for testing is After Effects, and here the 13500 managed to beat the 7600 even when using DDR4 memory, though performance was virtually identical. Armed with DDR5 though, the 13500 was 9% faster than the 7600 and just 8% slower than the 13600K. And the last productivity benchmark we have here is code compilation performance, and here the 13500 again performed very well, trailing the 13600K by a mere 3% margin, or 9% when using DDR4 memory. Either configuration also saw it beat the 7600, and it was 17% faster when using DDR5. Now, time for the gaming benchmarks, and we'll start with Factorio. Here the 13500 performed much the same using either DDR4 or DDR5 memory, and when using DDR5 it was just 3% slower than the 7600 and just 5% slower than the 13600K, so overall a great result for the locked Core i5 part. Now, I'm going to focus on the 1080p data, but I will show you the 1440p 11 game average data as well, but we'll do that a bit later on. So we'll start with Watch Dogs Legion, and here we see that the 13500 performed much better using DDR5 memory, delivering almost 20% greater performance. When limited to DDR4, we're looking at similar performance to that of the 5800X, But with DDR5, the 13500 was able to match the 7600, making it 9% slower than the 13600K. The Rainbow Six extraction results are very interesting, as here the 13500 appears to struggle quite a bit, though the results do make sense. The E-cores are of course completely useless here, so when it comes to gaming performance, the 13500 is going to be quite similar to the 12600K. It is clocked slightly lower, but it does pack 20% more L3 cache. And we see that when armed with the same DDR5 memory, the 13500 is 5% faster than the 12600K, but 14% slower than the 13600K and a massive 23% slower than the 7600. The Zen 4 processors do perform very well in this title, though to be fair, the 1% lows for the 13600K and 7600 are very comparable. The Hitman 3 performance, while very good overall, it's a bit lackluster when compared to the 7600, which matched the 13600K, at least for the average frame rate. Again, DDR5 did provide the best results, boosting the average frame rate by 13% to 205 FPS, the same performance delivered by the 5800X 3D, and this saw the 13500 trailing the 7600 by an 8% margin. The Core i5-13500 did manage 110 FPS in Spider-Man Remastered when using DDR5, and then 99 FPS when using DDR4, making the DDR5 configuration 11% faster. That also meant that the 13500 was just 4% slower than the 7600 and 7% slower than the 13600K, while it beat the 12600K by a 7% margin. So overall, solid performance, I'd say, and right where we really expect this part to land. Here we're looking at a rather substantial 20% performance uplift for the 13500 using DDR5 opposed to DDR4 in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, pumping out 228 FPS to make it 5% slower than the 7600 and 10% slower than the 13600K. So again, pretty well where you'd expect it to be given the specs, around 7% faster than the 12600K. Like Rainbow Six Extraction, Horizon Zero Dawn heavily favours the Zen 4 CPUs. In fact, this title seriously favours the AMD processors. DDR5 memory also doesn't help the 13500 here, and although it was just 8% slower than the 13600K, that made it a massive 26% slower than the 7600. The benefits of DDR5 memory are also apparent in Cyberpunk 2077, where the 13500 is up to 22% faster thanks to the additional bandwidth. Even so, with 181 FPS on average, that meant it was slightly slower than the 7600, just a 4% margin in this example. ACC benefits more from L3 cache performance than it does DRAM performance, but even so, DDR5 is offering a mild 5% jump here for the 13500, which saw it come in 10% slower than the 13600K and 7% slower than the 7600. And the second last game tested is the Riftbreaker, and here the 13500 does outperform the 7600, delivering 8% greater performance when armed with DDR5 memory. That also made it just 5% slower than the 13600K, so a great result here for Intel's new locked Core i5 processor. And last up, we have Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and this is another title where AMD Zen 4 processors perform really well. With 114 FPS on average, the 13500 was 11% faster than the 12600K, just 6% slower than the 13600K, and then 11% slower than the 7600. So a good result relative to the 13600K, but a little bit weaker than typical when compared to the 7600. Okay, so here's the 10-game average. Across the games tested, the 13500 with DDR5 memory ended up on average 9% slower than the 7600. If we were to remove games that heavily favoured the Zen 4 processors, such as CSGO, Rainbow Six Extraction, and in particular Horizon Zero Dawn, these processors would end up much more evenly matched. That said, we have found that this sample of games generally reflects what we see across a massive 40 to 50 game benchmark, at least within a few percent. The 13500 does stack up well to previous generation CPUs though when using DDR4 memory, offering 7% greater performance than the 5600X, which I estimate would make it around 12% faster than the old 12400. And here are the 1440p results for those of you interested, again using the RTX 4090. The 7600 was 9% faster than the 13500 using DDR5 memory, or 16% faster when limiting the i5 to DDR4. Using DDR5 though, the 13500 was also 5% faster than the 12600K, but then 7% slower than the 13600K, so again pretty much where you'd expect it to be. Now, when it comes to power consumption, for an all-core workload, the 13500 is relatively power efficient, pushing total system usage to 231 watts using DDR4 and then 266 watts with DDR5. That's comparable power usage to that of the 7700X for a similar level of performance. The 13500 was just 5% slower in this test. Having said that though, the 7700X isn't exactly an efficient product. The non-X version, so just the 7700, that delivered basically the same level of performance while using considerably less power. Still, even in this example, the 13500 basically matched the 7700 when using DDR4 memory, and here we see that power usage for the entire system is just 9% higher, so not too bad. Okay, time for the cost per frame analysis. And for the 13500 we've got two prices. One with the $115 G-Skill DDR4 3600CL16 kit, and then another using DDR5 6400. The DDR5 configuration is based on a $160 Z690 motherboard, which of course supports DDR5 memory, while the DDR4 configuration is based on a decent B660 board costing around $130. The Zen 4 processors are priced with the DDR5 6000CL30 memory that they were tested with, along with a $180 B650 board. Now I know there is a Gigabyte B650 board selling for $160, but there's only a single board at that price, so therefore I've adjusted our pricing up to $180 as this increases your options to 3 B650 boards. And based on those prices, the 7600 comes out to a cost of $2.53 per frame, and technically, with a little bit of overclocking, you could match the 7600X's level of performance, which would reduce the cost per frame of the non-X part to $2.43, but we're not including that data here as we're focusing on out-of-the-box performance. So when it comes to gaming performance, the 13500, it's a little bit disappointing in terms of value, with the DDR4 version coming in at a cost of $2.71 per frame or $2.77 for the DDR5 configuration, making it 9% more costly per frame when compared to the 7600. Even if we ignore the performance data, the cost of the 13500 on a DDR5 motherboard is equal to that of the 7600, while opting for DDR4 will save you a mere $65 and will without question result in less gaming performance. The Core i5-13500 is a very interesting CPU and certainly one of the best locked 13th gen CPUs that I've tested so far. That's because, unfortunately, the Core i3-13100 is pretty well dead on arrival at $150 US. It really needs to cost no more than about $100 to be viable in today's market. Then we have the Core i5-13400, which I'm yet to look at in detail, but realistically, it's not much of an upgrade from the 12400, especially for gamers, as it is essentially the same CPU with 11% more L3 cache and a 5% overclock. So that is a nice little upgrade, but at present it does cost 33% more. So again, basically another dead on arrival part. The 13500 though, with its 8 E-cores, this thing is genuinely a strong productivity CPU. Power consumption is very reasonable, and thermals are easy to keep in check with a decent cooler. Gaming performance is also solid, though it really does require expensive DDR5 memory to compete with the likes of the Ryzen 5 7600. But when it comes to productivity, it can edge out the Ryzen 7 7700X, though depending on the workload, it's not always a great deal faster than the 7600X, like what we see in our code compilation benchmark, while it can actually end up slightly slower in lightly threaded applications such as Photoshop. Overall though, I believe the 13500 is the superior productivity CPU, but of course it is worth comparing performance in the application you'll be using. Gaming though, it's a lot less clear cut, and in fact I think things swing the other way, with the 7600 being the superior choice here, even when factoring in value. The 7600 can also be easily overclocked to produce 7600X levels of gaming performance, and while that doesn't change things drastically, it does further advantage the Ryzen processor. Sadly, Intel has completely locked down BCLK overclocking for 13th gen non-K processors, so even if you have a motherboard supporting an external clock generator, it won't be able to do anything with a 13500, which really sucks. It's a big blow for this part and enthusiasts, and really, I think this is a poor move by Intel. The Intel box cooler, it also sucks. It's super loud, and it sees the 13500 suffer thermal throttling issues well within a minute, whereas the Wraith Stealth that comes with the 7600 not only avoids any thermal throttling issues, but it's also relatively quiet, certainly worlds quieter than the Intel cooler. You can also achieve the performance shown in this video with the AMD box cooler, whereas that's not always possible using Intel's cooler. But in my opinion, the single biggest blow to the Core i5-13500 is the LGA 1700 platform, which is now at the end of the road. It's effectively dead with no future prospects. Meanwhile, AM5 will be supported for years to come. It will support future CPU generations. Zen 5 is expected to be a radical upgrade, so having the ability to support future processors is a massive win, and it's why I'd buy the 7600 over the 13500. I feel had Intel offered more value for gamers, then it would make the choice a lot harder, but the fact that you need DDR5 memory to compete with the 7600, and DDR4 doesn't really help with the value equation anyway, unless you opt for 16 gigabytes, but I think at this point for a new system, builders really will want to invest in a 32 gigabyte kit. You can also purchase 16 gigabytes of DDR5 4800 CL38 for around $80, and while that might be around twice the price for a comparable DDR4 kit, it's a $40 saving by going DDR4, which is really peanuts once you factor in the cost of the motherboard and processor. So for productivity, I could see myself investing in the Core i5-13500, though I've got to admit for just $80 more, the Ryzen 7 7700 would tempt me, as the performance overall is similar, and you do get that upgrade path and then even better gaming performance, but I guess you could keep going. The non-K 13700, that can be had for $410, or the Ryzen 9 7900 for $430, and at that point we're talking about a very different budget. For gamers though, I just feel that the 13500 doesn't do enough, coming in at the same current asking price of the 12600K, while offering just 6% more performance on average, and that's not really enough to compete with the slightly cheaper and faster Ryzen 5 7600. So that's that really. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, subscribe for more content. We do have more content of this particular CPU coming up, and just more CPU content and other content in general. Also, Floatplane, Patreon, either of those will help support the channel, and you get some pretty cool perks in return. We have Discord and a monthly live stream. Yeah, we do a monthly live stream. Tim and I get together and do that. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.